What's going on, everybody? GoodMicWork commentaries back at you with another edition of the One-Off, and this episode should actually be called the Three-Off, because this was not a good day in professional wrestling. One of the more tragic days that I can remember in recent memory. And that's saying something, considering all the tragedies that we have to endure and the deaths and the needless losses that we as wrestling fans deal with on an extremely routine basis. Today was just an especially sad day. Nikolai Volkoff, Brian Christopher Lawler, and Brickhouse Brown have all passed away on July 29th, 2018. So I figured it was absolutely necessary for me to come up here and do a video and talk a little bit about all three of these guys. Now, Brickhouse Brown is a guy that I only have a few memories of. He is in a lot of my old CWA tapes that I traded 4 years ago, and I've seen him a lot in video, but as far as my personal memories go, I don't remember him quite as well as the other two. And the other reason why you don't see his date of birth and death on here is because there was a little bit of question as to when he exactly died, so I didn't want to put July 29th up there because as of the recording of this commentary, I still wasn't 100% sure the date of his actual death, but I do believe it has been confirmed that he did pass away today, and I'll get into a little bit about him later on. And as far as the two major deaths that we dealt with, the ones that the fans are talking the most about on social media and that we've been seeing a lot of YouTube videos on and things like that, are of course Nikolai Volkoff and Brian Christopher. Now, these two guys, it's ironic that they passed away on the same day because you cannot get more opposite of one another than these two guys are. I mean, in terms of who they are personally, what types of career they had, and the styles that they worked, you know, how they looked, every single thing about these guys personally and professionally were polar opposites. And I'm going to start with Nikolai Volkoff because I know the more juicy death and the more controversial death is Brian Christopher's, but I feel like I should start with Nikolai because he has been around professional wrestling for an incredibly long time. And he passed away today, July 29th, at the age of 70. And there's really no cause of death yet, not that I have seen. Maybe as of, by the time this commentary gets uploaded, something will be confirmed. But the only thing that I had read is that he was recently released from the hospital. I believe he lives in Maryland. And he was treated for dehydration there. And they released him, and then here it is a few days later, and he has passed away. So I'm not exactly sure what the official cause of death will turn out to be, but Nikolai Volkoff, man, I don't know if the younger audience really understand how long this guy has been around and what an incredibly long career he has had. He began wrestling in I think the 1960s. That was the first time he turned up in the WWE. Back then it was the WWF, and he also had a stint as a singles wrestler in the early days too. In the early 70s, he worked with Bruno Sammartino. Back then, I think he was calling himself Nikolai Volkoff, but still being billed from Mongolia. He was managed by Captain Lou Albano, which that's another thing. The amount of managers this guy had, he had Captain Lou Albano in his early days in WWE. He would have Bobby the Brain Heenan in the AWA, and later on he would have Classy Freddie Blassie during his run in the 80s in WWF. So the guy worked with arguably the three greatest wrestling managers of all time. That's pretty amazing. So his career just has so many different layers and levels and runs in the WWE. When I think of Nikolai Volkoff, he of course is most remembered probably for his run in the 80s with the Iron Sheik. But like I said, you know, he was in WWF in the 60s. He feuded or had a short feud with Bruno Sammartino. He worked in the AWA, and then he would return to the WWE in the early 80s, forming the tag team with the Iron Sheik. They were managed by Classy Freddie Blassie, and that was the epitome of heat. They had so much fucking heat because back then, that was still sort of new. Now, when you do a guy from another country and you villainize him, that's something that's been done over and over and over. But back in the day, back in the early 80s, Nikolai and Sheik and guys like that, they really pioneered that whole angle of having, you know, the evil foreigner come onto U.S. soil and, you know, and then the American has to fight against him and all that shit. You know, they started a lot of that stuff, and Nikolai had that great, deep singing voice. And I loved when he would sing the Russian national anthem. He would do that shit so often that when I was a kid in the 80s, I knew the words. I could sing the whole song. I could even sing both versions of the song because there was two. There was a short version that was about 20 seconds, and there was a second version that went like twice as long. And oftentimes, much like Elias in modern times, Nikolai would be interrupted by a babyface when he would try to sing, but sometimes he would be allowed to finish. And it would just enrage the crowd where they are just showering him with boos. It was such a great act. with Howard Finkel saying, Mr. Volkoff requests that you all please rise and show respect for the Russian national anthem. I mean, it was great. So I always loved, that heel run with Sheik and Volkoff. Sheik would eventually leave. He got in some trouble, I believe, and ended up having to leave WWE. I think that was when he got caught with Hacksaw Jim Duggan, got pulled over, and they had cocaine in the car and shit. So Sheik was out of there. And also during that time, Classy Freddie Blassie would retire. He sold the contracts of Sheik and Volkoff to Slick, and then Slick would also take over managing the Bolsheviks as well. So that whole act I thought was better with Blassie, and with Slick, being the manager there. Not that I didn't like Slick. I mean, Slick's one of my favorite managers and characters in WWE history. The guy was fucking hilarious, but he was no Classy Freddie Blassie, that's for sure. But Nikolai would not achieve the same success with the Bolsheviks. They never even won the titles. Back when Nikolai was with the Sheik, they actually won the tag team titles at the first ever WrestleMania, defeating Barry Windham and Mike Rotundo. So that team, I think, was just much better, but they were glorified jobbers as the Bolsheviks. They were always just thrown in front of teams to lose. They would always have to lose to the champs. I remember right after Strikeforce won the tag team belts from the Hearts, I think their first ever TV title defense ever was against the Bolsheviks on Saturday night's main event. It was a 2 out of 3 falls match, and they squashed them, beat them 2 falls to nothing. So, unfortunately, the Bolsheviks never really reached that height. As a matter of fact, there's another squash that comes to mind, WrestleMania 6. The Hart Foundation beat the Bolsheviks, ironically, when Nikolai was singing the Russian national anthem. Jim Neidhart went apeshit, attacked him from behind, and they wound up hitting their finish before the Bolsheviks even got their gear off, and Bret Hart scored the 3 count, and they won in record time at WrestleMania 6. So, the Bolsheviks were pretty much jobbers, but still a pretty memorable tag team. A lot of people forget, too, that after Boris Zukov left, and I think they did the breakup with Nikolai and Boris, Nikolai turned babyface, and then he became an American guy. He became very pro-West. He tried to make amends with the fans. He even wore the ring jacket, and he would start singing God Bless America instead of singing the Russian national anthem. He teamed for a bit with Hacksaw Jim Duggan. They had a big SummerSlam victory together over the Orient Express. Another pretty memorable thing that Nikolai did in WWE was something that I actually didn't like. They brought him back in 1994. I remember he returned to Monday Night Raw, and he was doing some interviews, ironically on the King's Court with Jerry Lawler. So Jerry Lawler doing that interview with Nikolai, his son and Nikolai would wind up dying on the same day. Pretty ironic. But I remember Nikolai came back in to do a couple of interviews, and he was still a babyface, and Jerry Lawler was making fun of him, the way he dressed. They were running a storyline where he was broke and he needed money, so he was trying to come back into the company to pay his bills and support his family. And Jerry Lawler made it extremely difficult for him and basically just made fun of him and humiliated him. And he wound up being hired by the $1 Million Man. So you would think that Nikolai was going to be turning heel and joining the corporation, but really, instead, he remained a babyface inside of a heel faction, and they dressed him up like a complete moron. $1 Million Man would wear the suits with the dollar signs on, the lapels, and they basically had the same thing for Nikolai, except for, instead of dollar signs, it was the cents sign, because he was broke. And he would be constantly insulted and humiliated by $1 Million Man on a weekly basis, and he never really even got his due, I don't believe. I don't remember how that whole thing blew off, but it seemed like, after they started just treating him like shit, he eventually just kind of became a part of the corporation. My memory escapes me at the moment on how they actually blew that thing off and when Nikolai left, but he was in and out of the company so many times after that, even all the way up, most recently, the last time I remember seeing Nikolai on WWE TV, he was doing a backstage segment with Lana and Rusev, I believe, so that's pretty recent. He would appear, I believe, in the Gimmick Battle Royal at WrestleMania 17. Anytime there was a special Raw or a Homecoming Raw or an Anniversary Raw, he would always be there, and WWE always brought him back in to do stuff because of how long he has been around. Did he ever really truly retire? I'm pretty sure he was working independent shows all the way up since the last couple of years at least. So the guy really never stopped working, and he always enjoyed meeting the fans and seemed like he truly enjoyed doing what he was doing. he made a pretty good life for himself over here in the United States and had a hell of a wrestling career, and one that, he wasn't a lot of flash and wasn't a lot of glitz and glamour. He wasn't Hogan and he wasn't Savage, but he definitely had a presence about him. He had a very unique style and look. I mean, he was a big barrel-chested big guy, but he had interesting mannerisms. You go back and watch Nikolai Volkoff's matches, watch the way he would sell for people. He would, just the way he would kind of shake his head and he would tremble, and when he would take bumps, he would kind of roll. He wouldn't take like flat back bumps. He would almost like kind of roll. Davey Boy Smith would do that a lot too. But he just had a very interesting way of, how he looked in the ring, how he sold, how he took bumps, how he delivered offense. It wasn't the same old shit. He definitely had a unique look and style to him. And I have fond memories of Nikolai. I mean, I remember almost every aspect of his career except for the 60s. I'm not that old, but, he was always a mainstay, and he always just had a good head on his shoulders. You never hear any bad stories about Nikolai Volkoff. Even in the 80s when everybody was fucked up, you didn't hear a whole lot of that about Nikolai. He just seemed like a good, solid man. And professional wrestling lost themselves a hell of a legend. So rest in peace, Nikolai Volkoff. My condolences out to your family and your friends and anybody that ever worked with you or knew you in the professional wrestling business. Let's move on to a more tragic situation now. Nikolai Volkoff was a wonderful man who lived a long life and passed away, hopefully in peace. The opposite of that is what happened to Brian Christopher today. It's ironic and it's eerie because when I read that Brian was arrested just a few weeks ago, I don't know how long ago this was, and I read the story that he was arrested again, and he's been in jail ever since, and apparently he took his own life in jail today, which is just absolutely horrifying. I guess the story is that he attempted to hang himself, and he was found, I guess maybe still alive, rushed to the hospital, placed on life support, but I think the damage was done. There was no bringing him back, and they turned off the machines. So that's incredibly sad and just such a horrible tragedy. You hate to hear stuff like this, and I've made my feelings known over the years on wrestling deaths, specifically ones like this that usually involve a lot of demons and drug and alcohol issues. And Brian Christopher is a guy that has just battled this shit for a solid 25 years or more. I mean, he has never been able to really turn his life around. We have seen some other guys in wrestling, guys like Scott Hall and others, Jake the Snake Roberts, that have had really traumatic lives, very dramatic lives, issues with their family, personal problems, psychological problems, drug problems, alcohol problems. Some of them are able to turn their lives around. Brian Christopher is a guy that we never ever heard anything like that. You never heard these stories of, Brian Christopher has been sober for 5 years now. He just seemed like he was always battling this stuff, always battling these addictions, and it's a shame. And taking his own life in jail, it doesn't get any lower than that. To think of where he must have been mentally, being inside that jail cell. And what I began to say a minute ago, the reason this was so eerie is because when I did read the story of him being arrested a few weeks ago, I said out loud in my house, I said, he's either going to turn his life around after this, and this is finally going to set him straight, or he's going to kill himself. When you think about somebody else that's kind of in his situation right now in professional wrestling, and right now, she's on my mind a lot, and that's Sunny, Tammy Sitch. And Tammy Sitch's, I'm no big fan of hers, everybody knows that, but I'm hoping if any of her friends or family are reading this Brian Christopher story that they'd reach out to her. I believe she's still in jail, right? Unless I missed something, unless she's been released and I didn't see it. As far as I know, she's in jail right now, so I almost hope that she gets a little bit of help and people reach out to her and make sure that she's okay. Because she has a lot of the same problems. Her and Brian Christopher are very much alike as far as the turmoil that they've had in their lives and the run-ins with the law and the drug problems and the alcohol issues and stuff. They're very, very, very similar. But Brian Christopher, man, it's a shame what happened to him because he could have been a big star. Hell, he was a big star. Everybody knows that he is the son of Jerry the King Lawler, and Brian Christopher was the crown jewel. He was the centerpiece of the USWA back in the day, and he had a good look. I mean, he was a good-looking kid with a great physique. He was a little on the short side and a little small, maybe not somebody WWE would push in the 1980s or anything like that, but, he was a good worker that came from a wrestling family that had a good look, and it just sucks that it had to end this way for him because he had a future. He definitely had potential in wrestling, and eventually when he did make it, to the WWE after working in USWA for so long. And he came in, what was it, maybe 1997, I believe. And right off the bat, they were teasing that he was Jerry Lawler's son, because by that point, with the dirt sheets and the slow birth of the internet starting, the word was out. Everybody pretty much knew that he was Lawler's son. And if you look at the two of them, they look exactly alike. So they played off of that a lot, but they didn't really do a whole lot with him upon his entry into WWE. He was in the light heavyweight division. He was feuding with Taka Michinoku and stuff like that. And it wasn't until he was randomly put together with Scott Taylor as kind of a jobber tag team. They were basically kind of like the Hardy Boys, really. You know, the Hardy Boys in like 1998 when they were wearing the loud colors, the Young Bucks and Rockers type of attire. And Christopher and Taylor were out there doing the same thing. They called themselves Too Much at the time, and they just wore matching fluorescent colored outfits. They came out to Brian Christopher's WWE music. That was a theme that I actually liked, and I think they used it for more than one guy. I can't remember who else used that theme, but I actually liked it. It was a slower type of theme, but I thought paired with the right individual, that theme could have been really over in WWE, but they really weren't overdoing the Too Much thing either. It wasn't until they started dancing and started randomly getting over like that and then changed their name to Too Cool, and then with the dancing gimmick and then the outfits got more outlandish, and they started getting over. They started getting over huge in a time where tag team wrestling in WWE was pretty fucking hot. You had Edge and Christian, you had the Hardys, you had the Dudleys, you had the Hollies, you had all sorts of great teams in WWE, and then you had Too Cool right there in the middle of it, and they kind of had the alliance with Rikishi as well, and the three of them would dance together, and the whole act was just amazing. The fans loved it. It got over to the point where WWE put the tag team titles on Too Cool. I think they beat Edge and Christian, if I'm not mistaken. My history might be wrong there, but I'm pretty sure that's who they beat to win the tag team title. So even though Brian Christopher wasn't, you know, a main event Hall of Fame world champion wrestler, he's a guy that's going to go down as pretty significant in the Attitude Era. Grandmaster Sexay and Scotty 2 Hotty, the whole team, the whole act was pretty over for that year and a half, whatever it was. And unfortunately, when the team disbanded, Brian Christopher never really found his niche again. He had some other random tag teams. I think he did something with Steve Blackman for a time, and then he went back and worked on the independents, all the while dealing with drug and alcohol issues. Even returned to the WWE a couple of times. Remember, when did he get in the ring and cut the promo on Lawler? When did that happen? What year was that? I kind of forgot, but I know that was relatively recently, at least within the last few years. So they have tried to bring Brian back in a time or two. I believe he even appeared in NXT at some point too, did he not? I could be wrong about that too. But no matter how many times he appeared or made a cameo somewhere, he never seemed to be any better off than he was before. And recently, who was it that just really viciously beat him up? He was in a fight with somebody. I think it was Chase Stevens, actually, and I don't remember what the situation was, but I do know there was an altercation, and Stevens just beat the shit out of Brian to the point where he had to be hospitalized and had to have some work done on himself. So the guy has just had a very tumultuous life, and it's just so sad when you hear about these. We've had some suicides before. Crash Holly is a name that comes to mind. Canyon, Renegade. I know there's been a few others, but every time you hear of a suicide, sometimes those are the most painful because you know they could have been avoided. They should still be here with us. Think of how many Von Erich boys are no longer here because of this shit. So wrestling has a dark underbelly, to say the least, and Brian Christopher is now unfortunately a part of that. I also feel very, very bad for Jerry Lawler today. It can't be easy as a father knowing that your son took his own life, because there's going to be a lot of self-blame, I would imagine. If I was in this situation, I'd probably blame myself. And hopefully there's enough people around Jerry Lawler that said, hey, there's nothing you can do, man. Everybody's responsible for their own actions. And Lawler, you know, if he feels any guilt for how he was as a father, or if maybe he could have done other things to prevent this death, I feel bad for him, because that's something that he's now going to have to live with for the rest of his life. And for Brian Christopher to take his own life, knowing what that's going to do to his family, you can only imagine what a dark place that Brian Christopher must have been in to not only do that to himself, but in that environment. Imagine just killing yourself in jail. You know, just not the greatest end for any human being, and it's just so sad. So my thoughts are with Jerry Lawler and his family today. I hope that they're all coping with this as well as possible. This is a absolutely horrible tragedy, and I just hope that they're all there for each other, because when something like this happens, you're all going to be looking at yourselves as, what could I have done to change it? And unfortunately, there's nothing you can really do. But instead of focusing on the bad, I would much rather focus on the good. That's why I opened this commentary with Nikolai Volkoff. I didn't want to start off with a suicide. Let's try to talk about as many positive things as we can on this horrible day in professional wrestling. So, if you want to leave your thoughts in the comments below about Brian Christopher, instead of, giving opinions on his suicide and his personal life and all of that, why don't you just leave some of your favorite memories of his time in WWE, being a part of Too Cool, some of his funnier moments or promos, or maybe even if you remember him as a wrestler in the USWA or have ever seen any footage of him. Let me know what you think. And for all of you ladies listening to this commentary right now, correct me if I'm wrong. Is he not a damn good-looking guy? I mean, when Brian Christopher was in his 20s, I'll tell you what, man, yeah, he didn't really have the height. Like I said, he was just a short little guy, but he was damn good looking. And I bet you that guy was drowning in women. So it's a shame. It's a shame that it ended that way for him. And rest in peace, man. And condolences to your friends and family. And the final death that I will speak about briefly here is we also lost Brickhouse Brown. Now, I mentioned in the beginning of the video that I don't have his date of death on here because I wasn't sure at first. When I saw on Twitter that he had passed away, I went to look up the story, and I originally had seen a date of July 20th that he died. And I'm like, okay, maybe he died a week ago. And then I read a couple of stories, and I ended up reading something to where he was pronounced dead like a week ago, but woke up or something. And he was in the hospital battling cancer, but apparently today he did officially pass away. My memories of him are actually not that much. I'm usually very familiar with these guys from the 80s and stuff. I usually have a lot of memories of these guys, but I never personally remember watching anything live on television involving Brickhouse Brown. My only exposure and my only experience with him is back when I was a tape trader. I've got a ton of footage from the CWA, and he is in a lot of the tapes that I have, so I've seen a few matches. I've seen some of his promos. The guy had a good look, a great look, I should say. He always reminded me of Apollo Creed, maybe even an early version of Ron Simmons. So the guy was pretty charismatic, heck of a look, and was well known, especially in the South. He never really did anything mainstream. He was never really in WWE or WCW. I do believe he had a stint in WWF as a jobber, like in the 90s. He worked a couple of TV tapings, but aside from that, he was primarily in the South. He was in Memphis. He was in WCCW. He worked a little bit in USWA as well in the 90s, and he had a run in AWA. So he was pretty much everywhere else except WWE. I want to say he might have even landed in Portland for a short time. So Brickhouse made the rounds, and he was a well-known non-WWE guy. And as a black man working in the South, in the Southern Territories in the 80s, it made for some really interesting angles and feuds that he was involved in back then, to say the least. So it's a shame, man. What a horrible day. We had 3 big deaths: Nikolai, Brian Christopher, and Brickhouse Brown. Hopefully, if any of you guys are sitting around on this Sunday evening and cruising around the internet, maybe you'll look up some matches and some moments from all 3 of these guys. They definitely left their mark on professional wrestling. And again, I want to apologize for not having too much to say about Brickhouse Brown. My personal memories of him are few and far between. I pretty much only remember what I saw in videotapes. But yeah, not the greatest news to see today. I actually had to get up kind of early and head into work to take care of a few things, so I wasn't even on my phone or looking at the internet or social media at all until about 1 p.m. my time when I was heading home. And I pull up Twitter and I'm like, holy shit. Did we have some losses today? So I figured I need to get up here and do a video on this ASAP. So rest in peace again to 3 great wrestling careers. Rest in peace Nikolai Volkoff, Brian Christopher, and Brickhouse Brown. And ironically, there's even kind of like a 4th death here too. There is a gentleman that I think was one of the founders of the Hardy Boys Omega promotion that was in the Carolinas. He's a guy that when I looked him up on Facebook, I recognized him. And I want to say I've met him before back in the day when I lived in the Carolinas, and I would run into the Hardy Boys a lot when they were really young, when they were like still teenagers. And I want to say I've met this guy somewhere before. His name was Tracy Cadell. He's the father of Trevor Lee, who I think works in TNA at the moment, indie guy. So you got to throw him on the list too, because, he's significant as well. So technically we've had 4 deaths today on July 29th, 2018. And these are, it doesn't get much worse than this, folks. And that's saying a lot considering how many deaths that we have to deal with. But whenever we get 4 in one day. Yeah, that's a bad day. So anyways, I'm going to get out of here. I'm going to let you guys talk amongst yourselves. Like I said, please leave me your thoughts, your memories, your comments about all these guys in the comments below. Would love to hear how certain wrestlers affect fans' lives and all that kind of stuff. So that's going to be it for me. It is now Sunday night. I will be up here tomorrow night for my live Raw watch along. So tune into the YouTube channel right as Raw starts, and I'll be up here watching the show with all of you. And I'm sure we will mention more about these deaths tomorrow. So you guys take care and have a good rest of your night, and I will talk to you tomorrow. Until then, peace.